Today's session is on the ethics of community, and it's always interesting. It's been very interesting to me when you're teaching other people's curriculum what they choose, because to me there was a source that was really obvious that wasn't included in today's sources when we talk about community. So I'm going to add it in. I don't have it in writing to put in front of us. But there is well known to a small group of people, to quote Rabbi Frankel, saying about the Jewish community, which is Kol Yisrael Aravim Zeh Bazeh. Every Israelite or every Jew is responsible one for the other. So sort of built into the system is this understanding that we have a communal responsibility to each other. And then that plays out in all kinds of ways. And we'll look at some of the sources in a moment that Hartman brings to elucidate some of that. I mean, we obviously, when we talked about the ethics of tzedakah and how you support needy people in your community, that is a part of it, right? Obviously, a part of it is how you support people in need. But the idea that we support each other as a community is not just in a time of need, that people, need certain things and we have to step up as a community. It's really, how do we build a sense of communal responsibility to one another in all of the various ways that can play itself out. Now, it's fairly obvious, but I think we'll just state it, that we in the history of the Jewish community live in unprecedented times. The word unprecedented has probably been used more in the last, 6 years of my life than all of the other years put together. But what's unprecedented is that the Jewish community either viewed itself in the land of Israel as a Jewish society that was the majority culture, that did have non-Jews that lived amongst them, but that the majority culture was a Jewish culture. And it was very clear that the responsibilities of citizenship and how one acted and how the government acted towards its citizens had, rules and bearing. And then for most of Jewish history, really until, in the course of Jewish history, 5 minutes ago, we lived in self-contained communities. We didn't live amongst non-Jews, or if we lived amongst non-Jews, we were afraid of them, and we tried to stay away from them and avoid interacting with the non-Jewish community as often as possible. And we had our own self-sustaining community. And so there was a big responsibility of how you created a community that was actually a lovely and pleasant place to live in. So Dan caught something on TV yesterday, and it was, I had forgotten about this. I walk in the living room and he's watching something in Yiddish with subtitles, because neither of us speak Yiddish. And Tevye and his daughters, TCM, was showing the Yiddish version of Shalom Aleichem, Tevye and his daughters. And it was 1939, which is a really chilling thing to watch in 1939, a movie in Yiddish, when within a couple of years, 90% of the Yiddish speaking Jewish world would be destroyed. But the movie was only on the story about the daughter that intermarries. And I had read the stories many years ago, but I was reminded that the 1971 version of the movie Fiddler on the Roof was a super whitewashing of the story of the daughter that intermarries. Because, the story of the daughter that intermarries in the 1971 movie is an American ethos, right? Like, okay, you kind of feel bad for the dad, but the daughter and the non-Jewish guy, he's such a universalist, and it's also, and in the actual story, the non-Jewish community, the Christian community is actually attacks the Jewish community. It's part of the pogrom that we see at the wedding is actually in reaction to one of their own marrying a Jewish girl. And the eviction is not the eviction of the whole community of Anatevka. The eviction is the eviction of Tevye's family for the audacity of this Jewish girl to marry into that community. And, we kind of forget that because the American ethos already in 1971 is the whole universalistic, how do we all live together? We all have friends and family members, right? Like family members that aren't Jewish. Like this was unthinkable 50, 60 years ago. Unthinkable, that we would have non-Jewish family members that we celebrate with, that are part of our family and part of our lives and part of the people that we think about how we care for and how we love. So the sources that we look at today all presume really that this is a Jewish community of Jews taking care of each other and having a community, I think there is a nostalgia for what it would mean to really have a tight-knit community of people that look out for one another. But the dark underside of a small community that look out for one another is that everybody's in your business. So there are wonderful things about this tight-knit community of people that look out for you. And then there's the judgment and the gossip and the other things that happen when everybody knows each other. But one of the struggles I would say today, and I think about this all the time as a rabbi, is how do you really, create community in a society that values, in American society, that it values so much the individual. My life, my concerns, I can do whatever I want as long as I'm not hurting anybody else. And even my Jewish life, I pick and choose. I decide when I want to do Jewish things, when I don't want to do Jewish things. There's no real communal pressure that tells me how I have to behave, certainly not ritually. And the majority of Jews in America don't belong to synagogues. So they're not part of the community really in that way. And so how do you create community? How do you create a caring community that cares for one another when it's, a totally voluntary community and people check in and out, right? When they want to. And then of course, this unbelievably added, new idea of what is a virtual community and how do we create virtual community. I was at a meeting yesterday with a group of Lonnie Nassiter asked to meet with just the women rabbis in Chicago. Why the women rabbis? I have no idea. Though there are about 30 of us in Chicago, which is actually remarkably stunning how many women rabbis are practicing in Chicago. But I am still the lone conservative pulpit female rabbi in all of greater Chicagoland. So, it's, that's the reality of how liberal our community is still not. But in any case, a lot of the women, and I know the male rabbis are talking about this too, but people that are leaving their synagogue because they can participate virtually with any synagogue they like for free anywhere in the country. So why would I pay dues when I can tune in to, so the whole question of community is it's more fraught. It's more fraught as time goes on. If you wonder this American ethos of individualism, but if you think like, is it alive and well? My body, my choice. I'll decide whether I want to get vaccinated or not. And I'm not really interested in hearing that there's a communal responsibility. I don't want to wear a mask. I don't care if it's going to keep you from getting sick. You're violating my rights. There's probably no more dramatic example than I can think of about the American ethos. If I want, I should have the right to carry a gun in the street. I want to go to Wisconsin and I want to carry a gun, and that's legal. So I'm carrying a gun and you're carrying a gun. And if people should get shot, the courts will figure out who is at fault. I personally would prefer to live in a society where people are not allowed to carry guns in the street and people are not allowed to shoot at each other. And the courts don't have to figure out who grabbed first, who shot first, who was threatened more. That would be my preference. But, you know, unfortunately, more and more, we see that that's not the preference of a lot of people, unless it's abortion, in which case then they have the right to tell me what I can do with my body. Marcia?
What you were saying that I have the right to do anything as long as it doesn't harm somebody else. I think we're losing or have lost the part that as long as it doesn't harm somebody else, because the people who are these strong individualists aren't even factoring that in anymore.
Right.
It's the community. Yeah. It's a community of one, which is kind of pitiful.
Yeah, that's true. It's not, I can do whatever I want as long as I'm not hurting anyone else. You're right. Gone. That's gone. I can do what I want. Yeah. My body, you know,
but it isn't.
This is the American, you know, individualism to the ultimate extreme. Listen, you know, if one could make a case that Jewish communal values also in fundamentalist communities could go to the extreme. You know, there are, but you know, one of the things that I think we've lost in the liberal communities of Judaism, and it's hard, there's pockets of it, but you know, if you are in the Orthodox community in West Rogers Park and Skokie, and you should get ill, be ill, or have a baby, people will be bringing you meals like for 3 months, right? Like there's no, I have to call, you know, this, like, if you need anything, just let me know. Right. That doesn't really, you know, they decide, they figure out what you need and give it to you. Like we've lost a lot of that sense of community and care. Who else had their hands up? Rosette?
Yeah, I actually just finished reading a wonderful book, and it is about community and the Orthodox. It's called On Division. And Goldie Goldblum, who is Hasidic, and it takes place in Williamsburg. And of course, it's this elderly woman who becomes pregnant, and she's now afraid to tell because it will be ostracized at her age, you know, that she is pregnant, and problems that go on when there are people within the community who have a few individualistic ideas that don't conform, and people die.
Right. Look, that's the whole thing. When you have a tight community, the pressure to conform, that's part of what kept Jews Jewish, right? Like you had to do what everybody else was doing. Nancy?
So a couple things. One is, what's your stance today on intermarriage as far as you're marrying someone? Because of course, exactly what you said, you know, do we throw people out and then the Jewish person I'm talking about, I want to marry someone not Jewish, and you say I won't marry you. Does that mean I'm totally turned off?
Jerry, turn off your mic.
Sorry. The other thing is that something you had said, I think during the high holidays, which really struck me when you say so few people belong to synagogues. And I had this conversation with a cousin of mine. When you said that you got to go to ballet classes and do things because of the Jewish community, that's what we support. It's not just supporting your individual synagogue. It's the money that goes to all the spokes that come out of that main circle. And I think it's important to let people in the community know that. I think people go, oh, what do I need to belong to that synagogue for? I don't go to services, but it goes so much further. And I keep thinking we're forgetting to tell people that stuff. I mean, it just disturbs me.
Hey, look, I went to dance classes because of the JCC, right? Like I got scholarship for dance class. All right, I want to look at some sources. So first of all, I want to say this is a huge concern in the community about our younger people. Are they going to financially support institutions, synagogues, JUF, JCC, day school? We are very concerned about that. And part of the challenges is these young people have been given a lot of things for free, right? Birthright, free trip to Israel, Chabad, it's free. Like they have major donors, it's not free. Somebody else is paying for it, but everything's free. Now I can go to Central Synagogue or Park Avenue Synagogue on my computer, free. We are raising a generation of people who are not going to say, I'd like to spend $3,000 for dues, thank you very much. And it's very concerning about what is going to happen. Intermarriage, I do not officiate intermarriages. That topic is going to take us totally far afield. I would be happy if you want to have a session to hear about my views on why I don't, officiated intermarriages, while at the same time trying to keep the couple in our community, which is a very fine line and a hard walk to say to people, I can't officiate at your intermarriage, but we'd still love for you to be part of this community, and you are welcome here, and we love you. It's not an easy stance to take in this day and age. And it is a complicated walk for every conservative rabbi, because that is the official policy of the conservative movement. And I have a lot of more unpopular thoughts that I could share with you about that none of you are going to probably like. But I'll just throw one thing out. So there are some conservative rabbis that have floated the idea that, could we consider doing an intermarriage if the couple was solely devoted to raising only Jewish children, and only having Jewish rituals in their home and not participating in any way with anything that wasn't Jewish. And I will say, you don't have to answer me. But if I said to you, I will do an intermarriage only under those circumstances, but I found out that your child is going to have a Christmas tree in their house for their non-Jewish partner, and so I'm now going to tell you that that's a wedding I won't do. I'll do this wedding, but not that wedding. Would that emotionally solve the issue for you? And I suspect that it wouldn't. So where does the line go? Where does the line go? I know you probably have a lot you'd want to say about that. I feel like we would need our own session just to talk about that. All right, so let's talk about communal ethics. Hold on one second. Let me just make sure I have the screen here. Okay. So this is from Pirkei Avot, which is a source, again, about 2,000 years old, a rabbinic source about 2,000 years old. And it's, what would make the ideal situation if you want to create, a good community, a healthy community, a community, that you'd want to be part of, what would you need? So Yehoshua ben Parachia and Nitai the Arbalite received the oral tradition. So there's in the beginning of this Jewish source of Pirkei Avot, there's a whole list of how this tradition was passed on, starting with Moses all the way to this rabbinic generation. So that's all they're referring to. So Yehoshua ben Parachia used to say, appoint for yourself a teacher, acquire for yourself a companion, and judge all men, all people, with the scale weighted in their favor. So again, this is a very, to a small group of people, a very famous source, a Selacha Rav. So everyone should have a rabbi, right? Everyone should have a rabbi, a Rav, a teacher. It's interesting, Rav, which we would translate as rabbi, the English translates as teacher. So everybody should have a teacher, right? Regardless of your age, you need to keep learning, right? You need to have somebody in the community. Everybody's an adult ed, so yay, you're following this, right? Everybody needs to continue to learn. And they particularly mean Judaism, right? This isn't just, study French. Everybody should be studying Judaism all the time and have a trusted person that you can study with. But at the same time, everyone needs a chaver. So chaver could be translated as friend. It could be translated as companion. But in Judaism, a chaver is your study partner. So everybody should have somebody that they're, that knows more than them, that they're learning from, but you shouldn't ever do it alone in isolation. You should be doing it with somebody else. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute. And judge everybody. The phrase in Hebrew, dan et kol ha'adam, judge every human being, l'chaf zchut, weighted in their favor. Judge everybody, or give everybody, maybe in English we would say, give everybody the benefit of the doubt. I mean, we unfortunately live in a society where we have also lost that value. So I want to say just the idea of a chaver. So in the Jewish tradition, there's a traditional way that you study. And actually all my years studying at Hartman, we did it this way. And it's called studying in Chavruta. So when you study in Chavruta, you have a study partner. You take the text that you're studying, you pair together, usually it's two people, you study the text together, and then you go into the lesson to learn about the text. And I have to say, for me, that was really revolutionary. I have a really hard time sitting still. I have a hard time learning on Zoom. I have a hard time, in college when, the ideal way that you study at university, right? You take your book. Sometimes you have study partners, but by and large, you take your textbook, you go to a quiet place, you read, you highlight the text. I was up and down to like the coffee machine 50,000 times. Like I shouldn't probably surprise any of you. It's hard for me to learn that way. And when I started seriously studying Judaism, and it didn't have to be quiet. You would go into the library, everybody would have a partner, other people would be talking. You didn't have to be like quiet. You could stand up, you could walk around, you could discuss the text. Jung talks about us having a like an evolutionary memory that's sort of built into us. You hear a lot of talk about this, about generational trauma. But if you have generational trauma baked in, you probably also have generational good things baked in as well. And it felt like I had found something that I had tapped into that I hadn't known was sort of part of my psyche. And so you study together and then you learn the text. And in ideal chavruta, you kind of challenge each other. My first really serious chavruta in rabbinical school, his Hebrew was much better than mine. So he was really good, like when we would stumble on words and we didn't understand them, like he was much better. He knew more than I did. And I was much better at stepping out of let's not worry so much what that one individual word means. Let's look at this concept here. And so we were good partners together in that way. We brought different strengths. So that's what a good chaver is supposed to do for you, to be able to support each other, to learn together, to challenge each other. And then you step in to the shiur, where the lesson, where the scholar is teaching, and you're more prepared to do that. So that's sort of what this text is talking about, that you need both in your life. And then, of course, they throw in this idea: judge everybody favorably, give people the benefit of the doubt. try to assume the best. It's hard. Like I was, it's hard. And it's certainly hard in the political situation that we live in today. I did a trip to Israel a couple years ago called Encounter, where you visit different Palestinian, some of them are leaders in their community, none of them are politicians, just to hear their narrative, which sometimes is really painful. Like I listened to somebody who talked about why blowing up pizza parlors is a legitimate form of protest against an occupation. Like that was not an easy thing to sit and listen to. And I thought to myself, after Trump was elected, could I really go to a listening tour in Trump country just to hear why they voted for him? Could it be worse than hearing that it was okay to blow up a pizza parlor? And yet it was easier to go and listen to Palestinians talk about their narrative and their oppression than to think about going to, Texas and listening to people who feel that this new abortion law, is good. Like the ability to say, like, this person might not be evil. They might have a point. They might have a value system that's different than mine. That really hard. But if it's hard to do to strangers, it's not always so easy to do to people in your community, right? People get hurt feelings, even in your family, right? People say something, people get hurt feelings. Why didn't they return my phone call? What to say, like, there's, judge everybody. My mother, I will say, like, if we would go, let's say, to a bank or somewhere, and the person that was like serving us was a little snippy, my mother would say, maybe they left a sick child at home and they're having a hard day.
It's the benefit of doubt.
Give somebody the benefit of the doubt. Right? Hard. But if you're going to try to live together in a community, a close-knit community where, I remember this from, like, we had a very close group of great aunts and uncles, but my mother, we also used to talk about, like, the wedding seating chart. Because this great aunt could be seated next to her sister-in-law because, in 1952, she had that's the reality of people, getting on each other's nerves and living close, quarters. So this source says, no, like the ideal way to try to create community is to fight back against that by giving everybody the benefit of the doubt. Okay, so we'll continue on. So Maimonides, 1200s, great, the Rambam, who writes the first really code of Jewish law, talks about okay, we said chaver, right? We said that a chaver is a study partner, someone that supports you and challenges you. But he says there are actually different types of friendship. That one hopefully in their life experiences all of them. So 3 types of friends: someone who's your friend for the sake of utility, someone who's a friend that can comfort you, and someone who's a friend of virtue. So a chaver of utility is a business partner, right? Or a sovereign, or your army buddy. Like, these are people, army buddy, I find interesting that he puts in here, because sometimes army buddies like save your life. So that doesn't really feel, you might be thrown together not because you had anything in common, or you really cared about each other, or that you have a deep friendship. And yet, whether you're business partners or whether you are soldiers in arms, you have a responsibility one to another to care for each other and support each other in a certain way. A friend of comfort could either be one that you benefit from the friendship, or somebody that you trust. A friend for friend for benefit has a different meaning in today's day and age. So we're not talking about that kind of friends with benefits. A friend for benefit is like the friendship between men and women. Which is interesting that they feel that he believed that men and women could actually be friends, because men and women didn't socialize so much. But a friend of trust means a friend on whom one can rely without withholding anything in deed or in word, or to one whom reveals everything, which is interesting because a friend of trust between men and women could also be, in his idea, even a husband and a wife, suggesting that husband and wives might not even share everything with one another. Of course, marriage being somewhat different than we would think about marriage today, but that you would have your real soulmate would be not your spouse, right? Your real soulmate could be the kind of friend that you could talk to everything about, good, bad, with no concern that this will lead to any loss for either of them. For if one trusts the other to this extent, he or she will find great comfort in their discussion. So if you're really lucky in life, you have a friend that's your soulmate that you can, so you have friends, that we all have friends, right? Social friends, people that you like, maybe you're in business together, maybe you're in a certain way where, you need to support each other. And there's a closeness to that. But then you have somebody that's even beyond that. I am actually blessed that I have a friend like this, my friend Lori. We've been friends since we were 8 years old. The kind of friend that you can really, really say anything to and not worry that you'll look bad, they'll think less of you. So that's a friend of comfort. And then a friend of virtue refers to a situation in which two friends desire and intend the same purpose, and that is goodness. And each will desire to draw strength from her or his friendship as good comes to them both. And this is the type of chaver that we are commanded to acquire. So it's not just the chaver that you study with, but a chaver that will challenge you to lead a life of goodness and a life of virtue. So you might have a friend that you can confide in and tell every nitty gritty thing about your life, and they'll support you and they'll understand and they'll love you no matter what. But you also need a chaver that challenges you to goodness and to be a better person. And that sort of is a hard role. If we think about last week when we talked about the ethics of rebuke, which we talked about, I felt that were very hard. But a real friend that to challenge you to be a better person is also the kind of friend that can say to you, you could have done better in that situation. Or I will say, this very dear friend of mine will say to me sometimes, if let's say, on the rare occasion, once every 10 years that I might confide in her that I'm annoyed with my husband. It's actually more than that. And sometimes she'll say to me, I think you were wrong and he was right. So it's like, okay, like that's a chaver of virtue that makes you go like, oh, maybe then I better think about that. Like I better think about why, So that's a chaver of virtue. So I want to talk about this, these sources, because these sources up until now really are talking about how do you create a community, which is really a social community. How do you create a community of friends? How do you surround yourself with people that you live with and you support each other for the good? But what kind of community are you trying to create? And what are the benchmarks of a good community? A place, there's always a thing, I see this on Facebook, sometimes you see it in the paper, like the 10 best cities to live in, right? And there are always these benchmarks, like they have a lot of parks, or the school system is good, the air is clean, the cost of living, like what would be the benchmarks of the type of society that you would want to live in? And so Maimonides is going to tell us what are the things that you would have to have in a community to make it a good community. So it's a positive commandment from the rabbis. So the rabbis are the ones that the Torah does talk about communal norms, but the rabbis are going to fill that out even more. So what would make a great community? people that visit the sick. These are all considered mitzvahs, right? People that visit the sick. You know, today, well, today it's hard to visit the sick because there are restrictions with COVID in hospitals, and that makes it really hard. I mean, I will say as a rabbi, and as family members, I think we understand that visiting the sick, once that was taken away from us, what that really meant in a society and how horrible that was, to not be able to do that. It is not always an easy mitzvah to perform. It is sometimes very hard to walk into the hospital room. I have to say, as a rabbi, it is sometimes very hard to walk in the hospital room of somebody that's very ill and that's suffering. But this was more expansive. I mean, today you would probably only walk into the hospital room, if you could, if it wasn't COVID, of somebody that you were pretty close to. Right? Somebody that was a family member or a very close friend. But there was an understanding, a much more expansive understanding about visiting the sick, that you would visit people that weren't necessarily at that close in that much of an inner circle. And there are texts that talk about how you alleviate people's suffering just by going to visit them. You know, I will say one time, you know, certain things happen and it just sticks in your mind. Because of course, as a rabbi, you're expected to visit the sick. And one time I walked into the hospital room of a congregant and she said to me, "I don't want you here, get out." And I left, you know, and it was like, but I kind of got it. Like, I kind of got like, how many people really like people walking in when you're not your best and you're not feeling well and whatever. But I've also heard, you know, ... she didn't visit me in the hospital. So it's hard to always know what people need and what people want. But so I err on the side of, showing up. But this was not supposed to be a job that was delegated to the religious professional, right? This was supposed to be a communal norm that if somebody was sick, you went and visited them because you helped alleviate their suffering by letting them know that there were people that were there for them. The other thing is comforting the mourner. Now, I will say, interestingly enough, I think in our, first I want to say, do think about this in light of COVID. All of the things that we would naturally do, go visit somebody in the hospital, go to a Shiva in person. You may or may not have appreciated what it meant to do that for somebody or to have somebody do that for you. But some of us who are on this call today experienced a loss where they couldn't have an in-person Shiva or go to an in-person Shiva. And once that was taken away, understanding what that meant. But the other thing to note that what we're supposed to do at a Shiva is comfort the mourner. And interestingly enough, what we're supposed to do when we comfort a mourner is actually to talk about the deceased, not to make small talk, not to have the mourner say, "Oh, and how is your mother?" We're supposed to talk about the person that's passed. And I think we are really good at showing up at a Shiva when it's not COVID, and not always so good about knowing what it is that we're supposed to do when we get there. So we're supposed to comfort the mourner. To escort the dead means to be at the burial and to escort the casket to the grave, and to involve oneself in all manners of the burial. So to participate in the burial, to be there for your community member that's lost someone. So visiting the sick, burying the dead, to provide a dowry for the bride. I'm sorry, that I don't know why they stuck the bride in the middle of this. To escort the dead, to provide a dowry for the bride, to accompany the departing guest, to involve oneself in all manner of burial, to carry the casket, to go before it, to eulogize, to dig, to bury. And now we're back to the bride and groom. So I don't know why it did that. As well as to bring joy to the bride and the groom. If you've ever seen a more traditional wedding where people like dance in front of the bride or the groom, if you think about Fiddler on the Roof, like with the bottle dance on their head, But I've seen this, unfortunately, again, I think we've lost this in the more liberal communities of Judaism. But I will say, for the Jewish community whose kids went to day school and went to Schechter, it still exists. So like, for example, they call it shtick. And at my son's wedding and at other weddings of people from this community, the guests do little skits, they do little plays. Claudia will appreciate this. I was just at Jacob Rabinowitz's wedding, and the shtick included Zachary, called me before the wedding and said, do we have any CJHS old paraphernalia or Schechter? And they came in dressed in, these few things that I had left, hats, and they greeted the bride as if they were Mr. Griffith. And if they were a couple of the other teachers, I can't remember. It was very funny, right? If you knew that world, it was very funny. Like, what would Mr. Griffith say at the wedding? Or what would, I don't know, if it was Claudia Linda, it would probably been in Spanish. And the idea is that you're supposed to celebrate a wedding by entertaining the bride and groom and getting out of your seat and dancing. That's what you're supposed to do, right? You're supposed to help make it festive for the bride and groom, which again, providing a dowry is providing if the bride is in need, but it's much more than that. Like, what does it mean to be a good guest at a wedding? So to be a good guest at a wedding, and I actually see now that the older that I get, the wedding's all about the young people, right? It's really all about the young people. To me, in my mind, the best weddings are when all of the young people are, out on the dance floor and having a good time, and providing for that. But it's seen as a mitzvah, actually. So what else are we supposed to do to provide a good community? So to bring joy to the bride and groom. And these are acts of loving kindness. One performs with one's body, and there's no maximum, right? So we talked about tzedakah, right? There are things that we are obligated to give money for, but helping bury someone, visiting the sick, providing joy for the bride and groom, these are acts of loving kindness. They're physical acts. Like, we don't tend to think about, we think about acts of loving kindness in many ways, but it's interesting to think about it as these are acts you perform with your body, not with your money, right? But with your body, and there's no maximum. You visit the sick once, you can visit them 20 times, right? You dance one dance at a wedding, you dance every dance at the wedding. Like, there's no way, according to Maimonides, there's no limit. It's unlimited. As much as you can possibly do, that's what you should do. And so where do we learn this from? Even though the Torah does not say, entertain the bride and groom. There's no verse about that in the Torah. There's very little about a wedding or a wedding ceremony, but the rabbis want to say, but there's got to be a basis in Torah for this. We didn't just make this up as a good thing. There has to be a basis in Torah for how we take care of people. And so, of course, the biblical verse, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And that is, whatever you would have others do to you, you shall do to your fellow. So how do we show our love for one another? By showing up for people, right? At times of need and times of joy. You might not know this. Maybe you do. They didn't mention a Brit Milah, right? They didn't mention a ritual circumcision, but you may or may not know that you are not actually supposed to invite somebody to a Brit Milah.
Really?
Yeah, you can say to them, the bris is this Tuesday at 9 o'clock. I actually remember the first time this happened to me. Somebody said to me, the bris is this Tuesday at 10 o'clock. And I'm like, did they expect me to come? Am I invited? What does that mean? They're informing me of the day and time. I'm an American and I'm a Midwesterner. I need a little more than that. Until I found out the reason that you don't invite somebody to a bris is then you obligate them to go. If you get an invitation to a bris, people, you got to go. It's a mitzvah. And if you don't go, you're violating the mitzvah of being there for this family. So the way around this is to just inform people when it is, and then they're not obligated. And if they can go, they go. And if they can't go, they can't go. So, you know, I will say as a total aside, so I think you all know, I hope you all know, but if you don't, I'll let you know that my daughter-in-law is pregnant and expecting in February. We are very thrilled. This will be our first, you know, God willing, poo poo poo, our first grandchild, and we're very excited. But this is also, I think, about living, what it means to live in a good community. This is my advice. So very often, occasionally, my son and daughter-in-law will call if they're having a little disagreement to get our advice. So the first thing is I always side with her, always. First of all, I usually think she's right and my son is wrong. But second of all, I feel like it's a much better investment in my future to always side with my daughter-in-law. But they were having, like, if they're, you know, having a bris, my son wants to include everybody that he's ever met or been friends with since he was, you know, 3 years old. And my daughter-in-law is a little more like, do we need to have a bris for 200 people? So I actually think she's right and he's wrong. So, so Shai says to me, but I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings, you know, by not including them. And I'm like, it's still COVID. Nobody's feelings are going to be hurt. Everybody is limiting everything. Everybody is going to understand that you don't want to have a big event for a newborn baby with it still COVID. So so don't feel bad if nobody tells you what day and time the bris is, you know, that's, you know, but, you know, but the idea is once, you know, once if you're actually invited, you're supposed to go. Horrible for planning, like, the food. Horrible for planning the food. So you might actually get invited because really it flies in the face of like, great, so I let 200 people know, how many bagels do we actually need? Vera.
Is it only for the bris or is it for other occasions? Like,
So it's only for the bris, though I will
Fine.
say the other thing that's quite like interesting just culturally in Israel, and I think this is true in other countries as well, but in Israel, you know, in the United States, wedding guest lists are very highly negotiated because it is extremely expensive to throw a wedding in the United States. So wedding lists are, you know, every family has to talk about how many did the groom get and how many the bride get and how many are left over for the kids. And it's a big deal because weddings are a fortune. Weddings in Israel are very, in comparison, are very inexpensive in comparison. And so guest lists in Israel tend to be much more open. And I've been invited to weddings like the third cousin twice removed, like, and so I've had people say to me in Israel, oh my God, the wedding is Saturday night. You should just come. Just come. I'm like, are you kidding? Like, could you imagine in the United States saying to somebody a week before the wedding, oh, just your cousins here, bring them too. Like, right. It's culturally and economically, you know, not done in the world that we live in, but in other communities, like everybody should come. Everybody should come. I want to share one last source with you. Okay, so the quality of life, Maimonides talks about the quality of life of how people are with one another. And that's the kind of society that you want to live in, how people treat each other, how people show up for each other, how people mourn and celebrate with each other. That's one way of creating a community. And the Talmud also talks about a different way. This is sort of, you know, quality of life. But these things also cost, like they're either paid through taxation or through donations. But what does it mean if we want to talk about the 10 best cities to live in? What else would a city need to create the kind of community that you want? So a sage, like, is not permitted to live in a city that does not have these 10 things. So these are the 10 things that a city would need that would, for people to live in. A court that flogs and punishes. Now, okay, flogs might sound rather shocking to us today, So let's reinterpret it, right? A system of justice, a court, right? A way that people are held accountable for their crimes and are punished. Should we add in a timely manner, right? That in order, a good society must have a court system. You don't really want to live in the Wild West. A charity fund for which monies are collected by 2 people and distributed by 3. So let's just stop there for 1 second, right? So a communal charity collected by 2, dispersed by 3. Why? Marcia?
Keeps everybody honest.
Keeps everybody honest. You do not want a charity where one person's collecting the money and that person's dispersing it, right? We would say you should be able to trust people. What was it? Trust but verify? What was that from? I don't remember what that phrase is from, but trust but verify, right? Like you want a
Ronald
society.
Reagan.
Okay, you was on the side. I can't believe I'm quoting Reagan, but in any case, if you live long enough, you want to make sure that the
do
communal
it, Liz.
structures are set up in such a way that that people are accountable for the money. They're accountable when it comes in, and they're accountable when it goes out. So the same 2 people that are collecting, you need a 3rd person that's with them to disperse that money, because 2 people could make a deal, right? So you don't want that to happen. A synagogue. You want a synagogue. And frankly, as I said, is we're going to this idea that you could virtually go to a synagogue online. In an ideal society, I mean, a synagogue online can work if the only thing that you want from a synagogue community or synagogue are services that you can watch in your living room or adult education. But what happens when it's time to bury a loved one or to visit the sick or to have a wedding, or any of these other things that a synagogue community is supposed to provide?
Minion.
Angela Buchholz is one of the most outstanding she's at Central Avenue in Central Synagogue in New York City, probably one of the most, unbelievable rabbis in the entire country, but she's not going to come to your Shiva in Chicago. A bathhouse, like you want quality of living. Remember, no, people didn't have their own bathhouse in their home unless they were extremely wealthy. So, good society is going to have, it's like synagogue gets put next to a bathhouse, but you want a bathhouse, a public bathroom, a doctor, a bloodletter. Remember, I said that these aren't this is not something that we would need today, a bloodletter, but unfortunately in ancient and not so ancient times, they thought that's how you helped heal people from illness, was to have a bloodletter do it for you, which is now, probably killed a lot of people more than saved a lot of people. But if that's considered medically necessary, then you would want somebody to be able to do that. A scribe, a ritual slaughterer, right? Quality of life. You like to live in a place with a kosher restaurant, the ability to get kosher meat. And believe me, for people that are kosher, that's actually a real consideration, even today. And a teacher of young children, right? You want to live in a good society. And if you think about, is that really so different today? We want good schools for our children. You want good medical care. You want, a place where there's a legal system that you have for, legal recourse. Everybody that is on this call wanted to be someplace where there was a synagogue. All of these things, these are what make up a good society. But of course, you have to have a societal structure that also supports all of these things. So a good community is one that has all of these structures, but also a society where people care about each other, care for each other, treat each other well, judge each other favorably. So you need both of these things to create a community, a good community, a place where you'd want to live. Norm.
I just want to go back for a second to Vera's question about is the bris the only example of that? I think there are a lot of examples where you have a situation where you can invite someone to do a mitzvah without thinking about it. I was aware for a long time of what the same thing happened to me that happened to you in terms of someone, a very close friend said, you know, there's a bris, it's whatever. And I said, and she said, I can't invite you. And so I learned about that.
I can't invite you. So then I think I'm not invited.
Right. So like when I'm Gabbai, often there's someone I want to give an aliyah to. And many times it's someone I don't know. Sometimes there are certain people who sometimes will take it and sometimes they won't. So I don't offer them the aliyah. Sometimes I'll just hold the card up and they'll shake their head no or so. So I don't offer it to them because I don't want to put them in that situation. Bridget and I always say motzi when we start eating. And many times we're at a table with other people and some people want to and other people don't. So we don't say, let's say motzi. We just say, we always say motzi and we start. And if people want to join us, that's fine. But there are many things like that. If you're aware of what's a mitzvah and what isn't, that you can do that with people and still follow the law.
Thank you. Judy.
I was surprised on the list, unless I didn't read the Hebrew, but there was no mikvah listed on the things city names.
No mikvah and no moil. So that's why these lists tend to get expanded because, yes, there's no mikvah. There are later sources that talk about building a mikvah and why it's important to build a mikvah. And just to remind people that, that Jewish women that were married and still menstruating were obligated to go to the mikveh after their periods, and that you were not allowed to have sex unless the woman went to the mikveh. So that would put a real damper on a wedding, on a marriage. So so that was to maintain what the rabbis would have thought of as normal family life. You did have to have a mikvah. So yes, later sources do talk about that, but interestingly enough, you're correct. That would be something you'd expect to find in this list. And a moil would have been something that you would have expected to find on this list because, you would have to, if you had a baby boy, you would have to, do a brit milah. So the list is, so you really need 12 things really for quality of life in a city, not just 10. But this is why the Jewish law doesn't end with the Talmud, right? Because it's like, oh, wait a minute.
Expansive.
You forgot these things. Anybody else? All right, well, this is, oh, yes, Hank.
I guess that, the rabbis are overridden by the Torah because there's no exception for a Kohen in what you read from Rambam. In other words, the burial and the rest of it. So that's from a higher calling than what the rabbis have mentioned.
Right. So we know, maybe we know that Kohanim are not allowed to go to cemeteries. If any of you have friends that, the exception is if it's your family member. Right, and that for the burial of your family member, you are Sharon. But on the other hand, with no mikvah, there might not be need for a moil. Right. So I'll tell you, I think this is a funny Talmudic story.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Right. You're very welcome. You're very welcome. There are questions, well, never mind. I'm not, there are questions about how long in our tradition you go to the mikveh after the end of menstruation. In the Torah, it's very clear that it's 7 days. You'd go to the mikveh after 7 days. But eventually the rabbis added on 5 more. And the reason that they actually give is that the women who were very scrupulous in following this explained to them that 7 might not be enough for everybody. And so they needed to do 12. And I wonder what the real motivation of all of these women that decided that really they needed 12 days where they didn't have marital relations. Like, I don't know if, what their real motivation was as to why these extra days got added on. Marcia?
I just wanted to say that this has been fabulous. And if Hartman has more, if you have more, just put out the date, you know.
Right.
I
We will
think
do- So
this
we're
is-
gonna do 6 on the last 6 that they have on ethics, and then we will have done the entire ethics curriculum, and then we can look at, they have faith, practice, and peoplehood. So we can keep this going for, you know, for quite a while. And now you see how it works. I'm gonna try to figure out, because I do have this curriculum, I'm going to try to figure out how, if we get people signed up in advance, we can either email you or mail you, hard mail, or, you know, the curriculum in advance. I'll still put the sources up because somebody will show up that didn't register in advance. But if we have everybody registering in advance, we should be able to send out the curriculum. And that way you can have it in front of you, or if you want to look at it in advance, or if you want to invite a chavruta and you have a study partner and study it together in advance, you could do that as well. So we will get that going. But I am also pleased. I think this went really well. And I'm very grateful to the Hartman Institute. We're a pilot synagogue. So we got all this curriculum free of charge. When they piloted it, they thought it would be in person. So we will let them know what it's like to pilot it by Zoom, and I will report back to them what our experience has been. So Liz, I still am like, even though there's no reason to have a winter break, I don't have any kids in school, I still feel like there's, we don't have class and, at the end of December, it's winter break. So we'll start up again in mid-January. And if anybody is having a break or going anywhere warm, I hope you all have a good trip, and we'll see each other soon.
Thank you.
All right,
Thank you.
bye-bye.
Thank you.
Been great. It's been
Thank you
great.
for a wonderful
Thank God
session.
for Zoom.
Thank you.
Thank God for Zoom. We can
Thank God.
participate even if we're away.
That's right. I expect to see you from Florida.